Sometimes keeping your word to one people means breaking your promise to another. And Thaddeus Bear Mallister was about to discover that some choices don't have right answers, only bloody consequences etched in the unforgiving Texan soil. It had been 6 months since Bear's sprawling ranch became neutral ground, a haven amidst the simmering tensions between the Comanche and the encroaching white settlers. 6 months of painstakingly crafted peace, meticulously respected boundaries, and the deceptive quiet that lulls a man into believing he's finally tamed the wilderness within and without. But peace in Texas has always been as fragile as morning frost clinging to a barbed wire fence, and this particular October morning promised to shatter everything, leaving behind a landscape of shattered ideals and irreversible decisions. Bear was splitting firewood behind his sturdy cabin, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar song against the backdrop of the awakening prairie, when the distant gunshots ripped through the stillness. Unmistakable, even at that distance, they echoed from the direction of Devil's Canyon, roughly 2 miles north. 3 quick shots, a chilling pause, then 2 more. That wasn't the sound of a hunter seeking game. It was the unmistakable cadence of trouble, a harbinger of violence swiftly approaching his fragile sanctuary. He set down his axe, its sharp edge glinting in the nascent sunlight, and strained his ears. The thunder of hoofbeats followed, irregular, frantic, the desperate rhythm of a horse being pushed beyond its breaking point. Bear had heard that rhythm before, a chilling soundtrack to the desperate flight of a soul teetering on the precipice of oblivion. Through the shimmering morning haze, a lone figure emerged from the canyon's maw, bent low over a pinto horse, a desperate prayer etched on his very posture. The horse was clearly nearing collapse, its breath ragged, its gait faltering. Even from a distance, Bear could discern the rider's long, dark hair streaming behind him, the telltale sign of a Comanche warrior, and the traditional clothing that marked him as one of White Bull's people. But something was profoundly wrong. The rider swayed precariously in the saddle, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Dark, ominous stains bloomed across his shirt, stains that could only be blood, a grim testament to the violence he was fleeing. Bear's stomach churned with a primal dread as he recognized the rider. Swift Eagle, the 19-year-old son of Running Wolf, one of White Bull's most trusted and fiercest warriors. The boy had visited Bear's ranch twice before as part of peaceful trading parties, his demeanor always respectful, his eyes filled with a quiet curiosity about the white man's strange ways of farming and raising livestock. Now, Swift Eagle was riding as if pursued by the hounds of hell itself, his face a mask of terror and pain. And judging by the approaching thunder of pursuing hoofbeats rapidly closing the distance, Bear realized that death wasn't far behind. The young Comanche managed to reach Bear's fence line before his horse finally succumbed, its legs buckling beneath it, collapsing to its knees and rolling onto its side with a mournful groan, its chest heaving in great shuddering gasps. Swift Eagle tumbled from the saddle, landing hard on the parched earth. He tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him, buckling immediately. Bear could now see that the blood wasn't just confined to his shirt. It was everywhere, seeping from what appeared to be a bullet wound in his shoulder and another, equally grievous, in his thigh. Bear ran toward the fallen warrior, his boots kicking up puffs of red dust, but Swift Eagle's hand shot instantly to the knife at his belt, his eyes wide and wild with pain and primordial fear. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, a torrent of words that Bear couldn't decipher, but the sheer desperation in his voice was a universal language. "Easy, son," Bear said, his voice low and calming, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm going to help you." Swift Eagle's eyes, clouded with pain, struggled to focus on Bear's face. Recognition flickered through the haze, a spark of hope igniting in their depths. He spoke again, this time in halting, broken English, each word a painful testament to his failing strength. "Soldiers, they come like shadows. You cannot help me." The sound of pursuing horses was growing deafening now, perhaps 5 minutes away at most. Bear could hear the distinct shouts of voices barking orders, the unmistakable jingle of cavalry equipment, the crisp, organized sound of a military pursuit. Official military business. "Why are they chasing you?" Bear asked. Knowing the answer would likely complicate an already impossible situation. But Swift Eagle was already succumbing to the encroaching darkness of unconsciousness, his head lolling to one side as blood loss inexorably took its toll. Bear found himself facing an impossible, gut-wrenching choice. By the treaty arrangements he'd so painstakingly helped negotiate, his ranch was supposed to be neutral ground, a sanctuary where neither Comanche nor white settlers could pursue their bloody conflicts. But that fragile neutrality had never been tested in such a brutal and immediate way. If he helped Swift Eagle, he'd be knowingly harboring a fugitive from the U.S. cavalry, defying the very laws he swore to uphold. If he turned the boy over to the soldiers, he'd be betraying the sacred trust of White Bull's people, condemning a wounded 19-year-old to almost certain death. The hoofbeats were so close now that Bear could distinguish individual horses, the rhythmic cadence of iron shoes striking stone. He estimated 8 or 10 riders, moving with the relentless purpose of a predator closing in on its prey. In less than 3 minutes, they'd crest the ridge and see everything. Swift Eagle, a crimson tide staining the earth around him, bleeding out in Bear's very yard. The exhausted, spent horse, a silent testament to the desperate flight. And the agonizing decision that Bear was about to be forced to make, a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life and the fate of those around him. Swift Eagle's eyelids fluttered open one last time, and he gripped Bear's shirt with surprising strength for someone so near death, his fingers digging into the fabric. "Sacred law," he whispered, his voice raspy and barely audible. If you help me live, you break sacred law. My father, he will have to kill you." Bear's blood turned to ice. He'd never heard of this particular law, a chilling rider to the already impossible dilemma, but the raw, unadulterated terror in Swift Eagle's eyes left no room for doubt. It was real, and it was deadly serious. But there was no time to think, no time to weigh the catastrophic consequences. The cavalry was almost upon them, a storm of righteous fury bearing down on his doorstep, and a 19-year-old boy was bleeding to death before his very eyes. Bear made the only choice his conscience would allow, the same unwavering choice that had landed him in this precarious situation 6 months ago, to do what he believed was right, regardless of the cost. He scooped Swift Eagle into his arms, the young warrior's blood soaking through both their shirts, a macabre baptism in the harsh realities of the Texas frontier. Behind them, the thunder of cavalry horses grew to a crescendo, a deafening roar that signaled the imminent arrival of judgment. Bear realized with a chilling certainty that he'd just made a decision that would either save 2 lives or irrevocably destroy them both, plunging the region into a maelstrom of violence. Bear barely managed to carry Swift Eagle inside his cabin, staggering under the weight of the wounded warrior before the cavalry thundered into his yard, their horses kicking up swirling clouds of dust that settled like a theatrical curtain over what was about to unfold, the most dangerous and consequential conversation of Bear's life. Through his window, Bear watched as 10 blue-uniformed soldiers, hardened veterans of countless skirmishes, spread out in a practiced formation around his cabin, their faces grim, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. At their head rode a man Bear had never encountered before, tall, lean, with the silver bars of a lieutenant gleaming on his collar, and the kind of cold, calculating eyes that had witnessed too much war and perhaps even reveled in its brutality. Bear quickly moved Swift Eagle to his bedroom, laying the unconscious warrior gently on his own bed, the scent of blood and sweat filling the small space, and covering him with thick woolen blankets. The blood was still seeping through the hastily applied bandages, but at least the young man was breathing steadily, a faint flicker of life in the face of overwhelming odds. A sharp, authoritative knock rattled Bear's front door, followed immediately by a voice that brooked no argument, a voice accustomed to command and immediate obedience. "Open up! This is Lieutenant Marcus Steele, United States Cavalry." Bear took a deep, steadying breath, wiped the blood from his hands as best he could, smearing the crimson across his calloused palms, and opened the door, steeling himself for the storm that was about to erupt. Lieutenant Steele stood on his porch, his posture radiating a coiled tension, one hand resting casually, almost possessively on his sidearm, the polished steel glinting in the sunlight. His pale blue eyes, sharp and penetrating, scanned Bear's face with an almost predatory intensity, searching for any flicker of deception, any sign of guilt. "Afternoon, Mr. Steele said, the word dripping with a condescending formality, though his tone made it abundantly clear that this wasn't a social call, but a prelude to something far more ominous. "Mallister, Thaddeus Mallister," Bear replied, meeting Steele's gaze with a steady, unwavering stare. "What can I do for you, Lieutenant?" "We're pursuing a Comanche warrior who brutally murdered 2 of my men this morning," Steele stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the simmering rage that danced in his eyes. "Witnesses saw him riding in this direction." Steele took a deliberate step closer, invading Bear's personal space, close enough that Bear could smell the stale tobacco clinging to his breath, the faint scent of gunpowder that permeated his uniform. "You wouldn't happen to have seen anything unusual, would you, Mr. Mallister? Anything at all?" Bear's mind raced, a whirlwind of desperate calculations and impossible scenarios. He could hear Swift Eagle's labored, shallow breathing filtering from the bedroom, a constant, agonizing reminder of the life hanging precariously in the balance. He was acutely aware of the damning bloodstains that adorned his shirt, stains he instinctively tried to conceal by keeping his arms crossed tightly across his chest, a futile attempt to hide the damning evidence. "I heard some gunshots earlier, yes," Bear said, choosing his words with the utmost care, each syllable a potential landmine. "Maybe an hour ago. Sounded like they came from up near Devil's Canyon." "That's precisely where we lost his trail," Steele confirmed, his eyes narrowing slightly, his gaze never wavering from Bear's face. One of the other soldiers, stationed at the edge of the yard, called out, "Horse tracks led directly down toward this ranch, sir. No sign of them going anywhere else." Steele's eyes narrowed further, his lips curling into a thin, almost imperceptible sneer. "Mind if we take a quick look around your property, Mr. Mallister?" "Just to be thorough, of course," he said, the word thorough dripping with veiled menace. Every primal instinct in Bear's body screamed, "Danger! Run!" If they found Swift Eagle, the boy's fate would be sealed within the hour, either shot down while resisting arrest, a convenient excuse for a summary execution, or strung up from the nearest tree, a grim warning to any who dared defy the authority of the U.S. cavalry. But if Bear refused the search, refused to cooperate, they'd know instantly that he was concealing something, that he was complicit in the warrior's escape. "Of course," Bear said, stepping aside, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird, his voice betraying none of the turmoil raging within him. "Though I should probably mention that this ranch is supposed to be neutral ground, as per the agreement I have with Chief White Bull. I'm not entirely certain your commanding officer would appreciate." "My commanding officer," Steele interrupted, his voice sharp and dismissive, cutting off Bear's feeble attempt at diplomacy, "is Colonel Harrison, and he's the one who personally sent us after this particular savage. You see, Mr. Mallister, the Comanche we're hunting didn't simply kill 2 soldiers in the heat of battle. He murdered them in cold blood while they were escorting a supply wagon to the reservation, a wagon laden with essential medicine and much-needed food intended for Comanche children." Bear felt as if he'd been struck a physical blow, the lieutenant's words landing like a punch to the gut. If that was indeed the truth, then Swift Eagle wasn't just a fugitive, a desperate escapee. He was a cold-blooded murderer, a traitor who had stolen vital supplies from his own people, condemning innocent children to suffering and death. But something about Steele's meticulously crafted story didn't quite ring true. Something in the way the lieutenant's eyes didn't quite meet his when he recounted the gruesome details. A subtle flicker of unease that betrayed a deeper, more sinister agenda. That's difficult to believe," Bear said carefully, treading on dangerous ground, probing for the cracks in Steele's carefully constructed facade. "The Comanche I've met, the people from White Bull's tribe, they wouldn't. Wouldn't what, Mr. Mallister?" Steele's voice hardened, losing its veneer of civility, his hand twitching involuntarily toward his sidearm. "Wouldn't brutally butcher 2 good men who were simply trying to help them? Wouldn't stoop so low as to steal desperately needed medicine from their own children?" He gestured curtly to his men, his gaze sweeping across the yard. "Spread out, boys. Check every building, every outbuilding, every possible hiding spot. "And remember," he added, his voice laced with a chilling warning, "this savage is wounded and therefore even more dangerous. Exercise extreme caution." Bear watched helplessly as the soldiers began their systematic search, their movements efficient and practiced, starting with his barn and working their way inexorably toward the cabin, each step bringing them closer to the truth, closer to discovering Swift Eagle's hiding place. He estimated he had perhaps 10 minutes, maybe less, before they reached the bedroom where the unconscious warrior lay concealed beneath a pile of blankets, clinging precariously to life. That's when he noticed something that sent a fresh wave of cold dread washing over him. One of the soldiers, a young, fresh-faced recruit, was carrying a distinctive leather pouch, undeniably Comanche-made, adorned with the same intricate beadwork he'd seen on White Bull's daughter during one of the trading parties 6 months ago. But this pouch bore dark, ominous stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood, a grim detail that sent Bear's imagination spiraling into darker and more disturbing scenarios. "Sergeant Morrison!" Steele called out, his voice sharp and commanding, and Bear realized with a jolt of recognition and rising horror that this was Sergeant Morrison, the son of Deputy Morrison from town. A young man Bear had known since he was a child. A boy who had grown up on the same hardscrabble land, who should have known better than to blindly follow orders that reeked of injustice. "Show Mr. Mallister what we recovered at the scene of the crime." Morrison reluctantly held up the blood-stained pouch, his face a mask of conflicted emotions, his eyes avoiding Bear's gaze. "This belonged to one of the dead soldiers, sir. Private Johnson. Had his personal effects inside. Letters from home, a photograph of his wife and children." Morrison's voice was tight with barely suppressed emotion, a raw, visceral grief that resonated with Bear on a deeply personal level. "The savage took it as a trophy, sir, a souvenir of his brutal act." Bear stared at the pouch, his mind working furiously, desperately trying to reconcile the evidence before him with his own understanding of the Comanche people. Something was fundamentally wrong with this carefully constructed picture. In all his dealings with the Comanche, he'd never known them to take such personal trophies, such intimate mementos of the deceased. They might seize weapons or horses as spoils of war, but intimate belongings like heartfelt letters and cherished photographs that went against everything he understood about their complex code of honor, their deeply ingrained respect for the dead. "May I examine it?" Bear asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning within him. Steele hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing, weighing the potential consequences of granting Bear's request. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he gestured to Morrison, who reluctantly handed over the pouch. Bear examined it carefully, running his calloused fingers over the intricate beadwork, noting the unique craftsmanship, the specific pattern of the design. He'd seen enough Comanche artistry over the past 6 months to recognize the subtle but distinct signatures of different tribal affiliations, the unique styles passed down through generations. And this pouch, despite its superficial resemblance to Comanche work, wasn't made by anyone from White Bull's tribe. The pattern was wrong, the colors were off, the overall aesthetic clashed with everything he knew about their artistry. Something about the beadwork lacked the intricate detail and subtle color variations he'd come to associate with White Bull's people. "This wasn't crafted by anyone from White Bull's tribe," Bear stated, his voice measured and resolute, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. "The beadwork pattern is all wrong. It's not their style." "Are you daring to call me a liar, Mr. Mallister?" Steele's hand moved instinctively back to his sidearm, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the handle, his eyes blazing with suppressed rage. "Are you implying that I would fabricate evidence to justify bringing a murderer to justice?" "I'm simply suggesting that there might be more to this story than—" Before Bear could finish his sentence, a loud crash erupted from inside the cabin, the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood echoing through the tense silence as one of the soldiers, overzealous in his search, knocked something over in Bear's small kitchen. Then came a shout, a triumphant cry that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline surging through Bear's veins. "Lieutenant, I found something!" Bear's heart stopped beating altogether, suspended in a terrifying moment of suspended animation. They'd found Swift Eagle. He was certain of it. The game was up, and all that remained was the inevitable bloody conclusion. But when the soldier emerged from the cabin, his face flushed with the thrill of the discovery, he wasn't dragging an unconscious Comanche warrior into the light. Instead, he was holding a blood-soaked shirt. Swift Eagle's shirt, the very shirt that Bear had been forced to cut away in order to tend to the young warrior's wounds, the damning evidence of his complicity in harboring a fugitive. "Fresh blood, sir," the soldier reported, his voice filled with undisguised triumph. "Still wet to the touch, and there's more of it in the bedroom, sir. Looks like someone's been doctoring wounds, covering up evidence." Steele turned back to Bear, his lips curving into a slow, predatory smile that was colder than a winter grave, a smile that promised pain and retribution. "Well, well, Mr. Mallister," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and thinly veiled contempt. "It seems your much-vaunted neutrality isn't quite as neutral as you so vehemently claimed, is it?" Bear realized with a growing sense of dread, a dawning horror that chilled him to the very core of his being, that he'd walked headlong into a carefully orchestrated trap, a meticulously planned deception that was about to cost not just his life, but Swift Eagle's as well. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the whispering wind, he could swear he heard the faint, rhythmic beat of war drums, a primal cadence that echoed across the prairie, a harbinger of the storm that was about to break. Bear raised his hands slowly, his palms open, his movements deliberately non-threatening, his mind racing desperately, searching for any plausible explanation, any desperate gambit that might somehow save Swift Eagle's life, even if it meant sacrificing his own. "That blood is mine, Lieutenant," Bear said, his voice firm despite the tremor that ran through his limbs, his eyes meeting Steele's unwavering gaze. "I cut myself splitting wood this morning, out behind the cabin. Caught my hand on a splinter. It was a deep cut, bled like hell." Steele examined Bear's hands with the thoroughness of a seasoned interrogator, his eyes scanning every inch of his calloused skin, searching for any inconsistencies, any telltale signs of a lie. "Funny thing about blood, Mallister," he said, his voice soft and deceptively calm. "Fresh blood is a vibrant, unmistakable shade of bright red. Old blood, on the other hand, oxidizes, turns a darker, more brownish hue." He held up the blood-soaked shirt, displaying it for all to see. "This blood, Mr. Mallister, is still as red as a freshly bloomed rose." The other soldiers had formed a loose but impenetrable circle around Bear, their rifles held casually but menacingly at the ready, not quite aimed directly at him, but close enough to send a clear, unambiguous message. He was surrounded, he was outnumbered, and he was running out of options. "Search the cabin again," Steele ordered, his voice leaving no room for dissent. Every room, every closet, every possible hiding place where a wounded savage might be concealed. "And this time," he added, his eyes narrowing, "move the furniture, leave no stone unturned." Bear felt beads of cold sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool October air, trickling down his temples and stinging his eyes. Swift Eagle was hidden under blankets in the bedroom, barely clinging to consciousness, still bleeding, his life slowly ebbing away. If the soldiers moved the bed, if they pulled back those covers— "Lieutenant," Sergeant Morrison said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, his face etched with a visible conflict. "Perhaps we should send word back to Colonel Harrison before we what, Sergeant?" Steele's voice carried a dangerous edge, a barely suppressed rage that threatened to erupt at any moment. "Before we arrest a man who's knowingly harboring a murderer? Before we complete the mission we were explicitly sent here to accomplish?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting nervously between Bear and Steele, his conscience clearly at war with his duty. "It's just that Mr. Mallister here has a formal agreement with the tribes, sir. If we violate that agreement without proper authorization—" "The only authorization I need," Steele interrupted, his voice like a viper's strike, "is 2 dead soldiers lying in the dust and a trail of blood leading directly to this ranch. That's authorization enough for me." He turned back to Bear, his eyes burning with a fanatical intensity. "You've got one last chance to tell me the truth, Mallister." "Where is he? Where are you hiding the murdering savage?" Bear looked into Steele's cold, unyielding eyes and realized with a sinking feeling of utter despair that the truth wouldn't matter to this man. Whether Swift Eagle was genuinely guilty or tragically innocent, whether he'd deliberately murdered those soldiers or been framed as part of a larger, more sinister plot, Steele had already decided how this story was going to end, and nothing Bear could say or do would change that predetermined outcome. "I honestly don't know what you're talking about, Lieutenant," Bear said, his voice unwavering despite the tremor in his hands, his gaze locked on Steele's, refusing to back down in the face of overwhelming odds. Steele nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if he'd fully expected that answer, as if Bear's denial was merely a formality, a predictable step in a well-rehearsed dance of deception. "Sergeant Morrison," he ordered, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "take 3 men and start with the bedroom. If you find what I strongly suspect you're going to find, we'll be holding a trial right here in this very yard. A swift trial, a just trial, a very public trial." Bear's blood turned to ice in his veins. A trial? He knew exactly what kind of trial Steele had in mind. A kangaroo court, a mockery of justice, with Steele acting as judge, jury, and executioner, all conveniently wrapped up in a veneer of legality. Steele's smile was like a glinting knife blade, a promise of swift and brutal retribution. "The penalty for knowingly harboring a murderer is death, Mr. Mallister," Steele said, his voice laced with a chilling satisfaction. "And the standard penalty for brutally murdering soldiers of the United States Army is a rope around the neck, a short drop, and a long, agonizing wait." That's when Bear heard it again, a sound that made every man in the yard freeze in their tracks, a sound that cut through the tension like a thunderclap, the unmistakable cadence of war drums, distant but growing louder with each passing moment, coming from the direction of the rolling hills to the west. The slow, steady, deliberate rhythm that could mean only one thing. The Comanche were mobilizing for war, preparing for something big, something momentous, something potentially catastrophic. Morrison went visibly pale, his youthful face losing what little color it had left. "Lieutenant!" he stammered, his voice barely audible above the rising crescendo of the drums. "If those drums mean what I think they mean nothing," Steele snapped, his voice sharp and dismissive, his attempt at bravado failing to mask the flicker of uncertainty that now danced in his eyes. "White Bull's people won't risk open warfare with the United States Army over one rogue renegade warrior. It's simply not logical." But Bear knew better. He knew the depths of the Comanches' fierce loyalty to their own, the unwavering commitment to protecting their families and their sacred traditions. Those drums weren't just signaling the formation of a war party. They were announcing something far more significant. That Running Wolf, Swift Eagle's father, had discovered his son was missing, and he suspected foul play. And if Running Wolf even remotely suspected that the cavalry had intentionally harmed his boy, had ambushed him or murdered him in cold blood. The drums grew louder, the rhythmic cadence intensifying, and now Bear could clearly distinguish a second distinct rhythm joining the first, a different tempo, a different beat. Then a third rhythm erupted, a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the very ground beneath their feet. 3 different tribes, all beating their war drums simultaneously, all united in a single deafening call to arms. That hadn't happened in Bear's living memory, and the implications were terrifying. Steele's carefully constructed confidence was beginning to crumble, cracks appearing in his carefully crafted facade of authority. "How many warriors does White Bull command, Mallister?" he asked, his voice losing its earlier arrogance, replaced by a desperate plea for information. "On a good day, maybe 300, Bear replied, his eyes scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of the impending storm. He paused, listening intently to the escalating drums, his heart pounding in his chest. But if he's allied with the other chiefs, if the other tribes have joined his cause, then you're potentially looking at close to 1,000 warriors, Lieutenant, maybe more. One of Steele's soldiers, a grizzled veteran with a 1,000-yard stare, swore under his breath, the expletive lost in the rising tide of the war drums. Another soldier, his face pale and drawn, started nervously checking his ammunition, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the cartridges. "They won't attack U.S. Army soldiers," Steele said, his voice lacking its earlier conviction, his attempt at reassurance falling flat. "They know the consequences of such an act." They will if they believe you murdered one of their children, Bear replied, his voice low and steady, his eyes meeting Steele's with unwavering intensity. And right now, Lieutenant, that's exactly what they believe. Whether it's true or not, that's their perception, and perception is everything out here. The drums stopped suddenly, the silence that followed more deafening, more terrifying than the cacophony that had preceded it. In that pregnant silence, Bear could hear something else, a sound that sent a chill running down his spine, a sound that signaled the imminent arrival of a force far more dangerous and unstoppable than any he had yet imagined. The thunder of countless horses, the earth-shattering rumble of a vast war party moving swiftly across the prairie, heading directly for his ranch, their intentions clear, their purpose unwavering. Swift Eagle's rescue party was coming, fueled by vengeance, driven by grief, and they were coming for blood. Lieutenant Steele's face transformed in the span of a heartbeat, his confident swagger evaporating, replaced by a raw, primal fear that was almost palpable. "How much time do we have?" he demanded, his voice tight with panic, his eyes darting nervously around the yard. Bear tilted his head slightly, listening intently to the approaching thunder of hoofbeats, gauging the distance, calculating the speed. 5 minutes, maybe less, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Damn it to hell! Steele spun around, his voice cracking with desperation. Forget the damn search. Form a defensive perimeter around the cabin. Morrison, get the horses saddled and ready for a fighting retreat. We need to get out of here before... But Bear was already moving, his actions swift and decisive, heading toward his cabin with a clear sense of purpose, his eyes fixed on the door. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice cutting through the rising panic, "if you want to live through the next hour, you need to listen to me very carefully. Put your pride aside and hear what I have to say." Steele grabbed Bear's arm, his grip tight and desperate. "Where do you think you're going, Mallister? You're not planning to betray us, are you?" "I'm going to try and save all our lives," Bear replied, pulling his arm free from Steele's grasp. "That war party isn't coming here to negotiate, Lieutenant. They're coming because they sincerely believe you killed Swift Eagle, and they're thirsty for revenge. The only way to avert a massacre is to prove them wrong, to show them that he's still alive." "By harboring a known murderer?" Steele sputtered, his face contorted with incredulity. "By betraying my own men, by siding with the savages? By finding out the truth?" Bear's voice cut through Steele's protests, his eyes burning with righteous indignation. "Something about your carefully constructed story doesn't add up, Lieutenant. That Comanche pouch with the wrong beadwork, the way you were so eager to skip a proper investigation, the fact that you're out here with just 10 men chasing a supposedly dangerous killer, it all stinks to high heaven." The thunder of approaching horses was growing louder, closer, more ominous. And now Bear could distinguish individual war cries carried on the wind, chilling cries that promised death and vengeance. Steele's soldiers were frantically setting up a makeshift defensive position behind whatever meager cover they could find, their faces pale with fear, their hands trembling as they loaded their rifles. 10 men against a full-scale Comanche war party was nothing short of suicide. "What are you suggesting, Mallister?" Steele asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his hand still resting on his holstered gun, ready to draw at a moment's notice. "I'm suggesting that maybe Swift Eagle isn't the cold-blooded murderer you claim he is," Bear replied, his eyes locked on Steele's, probing for the truth. "And I'm suggesting that when Running Wolf gets here, you better have a damn good explanation for why his son is bleeding to death in my bedroom." Steele's face went ashen, all the color draining from his cheeks. "How did you—" "Because I'm not an idiot, Lieutenant," Bear interrupted, his voice laced with sarcasm. "The boy rode into my yard wounded and desperate, babbling about soldiers chasing him. You conveniently show up an hour later with a meticulously crafted story about murdered escorts and stolen medicine. Does that sound like the appropriate response to a simple crime, Lieutenant? Or does it sound like the reaction of a desperate father who thinks his son was ambushed, betrayed?" Morrison appeared at Steele's shoulder, his face etched with concern. "Lieutenant, we've got riders converging on us from at least 3 different directions. Looks like they're trying to surround us, sir." Bear felt a chill run down his spine, a premonition of disaster. If the Comanche had deliberately split into multiple groups, this wasn't just a spontaneous rescue mission. It was a coordinated military operation, a carefully planned and executed maneuver. That meant White Bull himself was likely involved, and it meant that the situation was far worse than anyone had initially imagined. "There's something you're not telling me, Lieutenant," Bear said, his voice low and intense, his eyes boring into Steele's. "What really happened this morning? What's the full story?" Steele's jaw worked silently for a moment, his teeth clenched tight, his eyes darting nervously around the yard. Bear could see the internal struggle playing out on his face, the battle between his ingrained sense of duty and the crushing weight of his guilt. Finally, the lieutenant spoke, his voice barely audible, a confession whispered on the edge of despair. "We weren't escorting a supply wagon, damn it. We were escorting a surveyor." Bear's blood turned to ice. A surveyor? A government man sent to map out reservation boundaries, to identify valuable resources, to pave the way for the inevitable encroachment of white settlers? The Comanche weren't supposed to know about it. The whole operation was supposed to be conducted in complete secrecy. Steele's carefully constructed confidence had completely evaporated now, replaced by something that looked eerily like shame, a flicker of remorse in those cold, calculating eyes. "Swift Eagle caught us marking trees near their sacred burial grounds," Steele continued, his voice cracking, his hands trembling. "He tried to stop us, tried to prevent us from desecrating their holy places, and you shot him for defending his people's most sacred traditions, for protecting their heritage from those who sought to exploit and destroy it." "It wasn't supposed to happen like that, Mallister." Steele's voice cracked, his eyes pleading for understanding, for absolution that Bear was in no position to give. The surveyor panicked, started shooting. Swift Eagle fought back in self-defense. He killed the surveyor and one of my men before we could stop him. The truth hit Bear like a physical blow, the weight of it crushing him. Swift Eagle wasn't a murderer. He was a young warrior who had stumbled onto a government conspiracy, a clandestine operation to steal more Comanche land, to exploit their resources, to systematically erode their way of life. The murdered soldiers weren't innocent victims. They were casualties of an illegal surveying operation that never should have happened in the first place, casualties of Steele's greed and corruption. So as we see Bear standing at the precipice, facing impossible choices and the brutal realities of a broken promise, the heart of the story truly boils down to the agonizing struggle between conflicting loyalties and the courage it takes to stand for what's right, even when it means facing devastating consequences. It's a powerful reminder that in a world painted in shades of gray, moral clarity often demands a sacrifice, a willingness to risk everything for the sake of justice and compassion. What did you think of Bear's situation? What would you have done in his place? I'd love to hear your thoughts and interpretations in the comments below. Feel free to leave a question, share an opinion, or just join the discussion. And if you enjoyed delving into this complex moral dilemma, please consider subscribing. That way you won't miss out on future stories where we explore the gray areas of human experience and the courage it takes to navigate them. Thanks for watching.